Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today we've got a great one for you guys. Now, I've seen videos all over YouTube, people on all types of social media talking about the best decks to play in Pokemon TCG Pocket, but today we're going to use actual data and real statistics to figure out just which decks you should be playing, which decks are the best decks to play, which decks are the most consistent, which decks are winning the most, and which decks have the best matchups. Before we get into it, let's talk about the data that we used to make this video. So I took data from the 10 largest online Pokemon TCG Pocket tournaments on the Play.Limitless platform. If you don't know what Play.Limitless is, link will be down in the description below, but it's basically the best place to go to compete in online tournaments for any of the Pokemon TCG games. But I collected all of this data from the 10 largest tournaments over the last few weeks, and in these tournaments there were over 7,000 total participants and over 20,000 total matches that we've accumulated and parsed out all of this data. So this is certainly going to be getting down to the bottom of things here. 100% real statistics, 100% real data. First, let's start off by taking a look at Pikachu EX metashare here. So Pikachu is actually a little bit different. My next video on Pokemon TCG Pocket is actually going to be talking exclusively about Pikachu EX decks, because there's actually like 4 or 5 different variants of Pikachu EX that people are playing, especially in online tournaments. They pair Pikachu EX up with Zapdos EX, Pincurchin. Sometimes they match it up with Zebstrika or Voltorb or even Raichu. So there's a lot of different ways to play Pikachu, but for the sake of this video, we kind of took the averages of all of the different Pikachu decks, and we used it to determine the statistics that we're going to look at today in this video. But the next video that I'm going to make on Pokemon TCG Pocket will be going in depth on Pikachu EX itself. But Pikachu EX is the most played deck in all of these online tournaments with a 28.71% meta share. So over 1/4 of the decks being played in these tournaments are Pikachu EX decks, and the average win rate for Pikachu EX in these tournaments is just over 50%, 50.38%. Now this is actually fairly common. Like, decks that are the most popular decks, which of course being, Pikachu EX and some other deck that you'll see here next coming up, the more people that are playing a particular deck, the more it's going to have a win rate close to 50%. There's no dominant, archetype in Pokemon TCG Pocket. If there is, it's going to be Pikachu EX, but as you can see, a 50.38% win rate as the most popular deck, parsing out literally thousands of people playing this deck over the 10 tournaments that we took data from. 50.38% win rate isn't anything absolutely crazy. So what you'll see, I think, in this video is that the overall meta of Pokemon TCG Pocket is fairly balanced, at least among the top decks. But Pikachu EX, it's a great deck. I mean, it's the most popular version of any of the decks that people play in Pokemon TCG Pocket. It's fast-paced, it's consistent. Pikachu EX as a card is arguably the best card in Pokemon TCG Pocket, doing a consistent 90 damage for 2 energies on a basic EX Pokemon. It's right up there with things like Starmie EX or even Articuno in terms of just powerful attackers and consistent cards. Next, let's take a look at the matchups for Pikachu EX, and as you can see here, pretty even across the board, but actually favorable against the other 3 most played archetypes in Pokemon TCG Pocket. For the sake of this video, we're just going to be taking a look at basically the 4 most played archetypes here, being Pikachu, Mewtwo, Charizard, and Articuno / Starmie / Misty. These 4 decks make up over like 75% of the meta share in all of these online tournaments. So there's a lot of other decks. We'll go over it at the end, some of the rogue decks or least commonly played decks. But for the purpose of this video and the purpose of keeping our sample size large enough to kind of quantify into any proper data set, we're just going to be looking at how each of these archetypes interact with each other in terms of the top 4 archetypes here. But as you can see, Pikachu pretty dominant across the board, pretty even win rate here against Mewtwo EX with a 50.3% win rate, and very good matchups across the board against Charizard EX and the Misty decks here with Articuno. As we can see there, about a 60% win rate against Charizard and a 65% win rate against Articuno EX. So a theme that you'll see in this video is that Mewtwo and Pikachu are probably going to be definitely the top decks. They're certainly the most played decks, but Pikachu overall having a great matchup against the other 2 most played decks in the format. I think that against Charizard, you're hitting Moltres for super effective damage. Charizard just takes so long to set up that Pikachu doesn't take very long to set up. So you can get damage output very early. You can hit that Moltres for super effective damage because it is weak to electric type, and overall just kind of results in a very good matchup determined by the pace and the consistency of the Pikachu EX decks. And then Articuno EX, again, I think that the thing is Pikachu hits everything in the Misty decks for super effective damage, and that really comes down to it. Doing 90 damage plus 20 with the super effectiveness, doing 110 damage, that's not a particularly valuable number, but it's about the 20 damage peck that you do on Zapdos, or the the 70 damage you do from a Voltorb or things like that. It really starts to add up in the early game, and that chip damage later in the game as well. So yeah, Pikachu, great matchups across the board. Next, let's take a look at Mewtwo EX, the second most played deck in Pokemon TCG Pocket across the largest online tournaments, with a 26.29% meta share, actually just a little bit below Pikachu. Again, we factored in all of the different Pikachu archetypes into this data, whereas Mewtwo, there's really only one archetype of Mewtwo EX that people are playing, and that is with Gardevoir, that accelerates the energies. But as we can see here, the average win rate of Mewtwo EX across these tournaments is actually 48.49%. So Mewtwo EX seems to have an overall less consistent win rate percentage in these online tournaments. But the thing with Mewtwo EX, in my opinion, is that it's still a little bit too inconsistent. Most decks that have really good damage output, especially on a basic Pokemon like this, there's going to be a catch to it, right? There's going to be some facet of this deck that just doesn't flow perfectly all the time. And for Mewtwo EX, it's the energy acceleration options, right? This deck is basically 100% reliant on getting Gardevoir down onto your bench, which is a stage 2 Pokemon, so you have to find a route, so you got to get it onto your bench, then you got to find a Kirlia, evolve it, and then you got to evolve into Gardevoir. So at the very least, you're going to get that Gardevoir up on turn 3 or turn 4, but oftentimes it's taking turn 5 and turn 6, and just doing 50 damage with Psychic Sphere is really not going to be enough to cut it, especially when you're getting 2-hit KO'd by most of the attackers in the format. Let's take a look at the matchup share here for Mewtwo EX, and this is actually a lot more interesting than I thought. So pretty even win rates across the board with Articuno against Articuno EX and Pikachu EX here, with a 49% win rate for them both respectively. Now what we see in online tournaments, since this is sort of the average matchups and the average win rates for Mewtwo EX, but what we often see is that all of the Mewtwo EX decks that make it into Final Cut or Top Cut, they actually do pretty well consistently against Pikachu EX. And since Mewtwo and Pikachu EX are the two most common decks in all of these online tournaments and in all of Pokemon TCG Pocket, most of the top 8 Final Cut brackets in these online tournaments is basically entirely made up of Mewtwo and Pikachu, and it really does kind of come up to a coin toss between these two decks. However, if the format is a best of 3, Mewtwo tends to come out on top just because it has a higher upside if it does in fact draw well. But a 44.2% win rate against Charizard EX, this matchup is not very, very good for Mewtwo, and this might be a surprise to somebody. It's not necessarily a surprise to me, I don't think, because both decks are very similar in terms of their pacing. They're both kind of mid-range decks that take a little while to set up, but once they do, there's a lot of upside. The thing is with Charizard, and I think this matchup really just comes down to the math, where Charizard has 180 HP, so Mewtwo cannot one-hit KO at Charizard EX. However, Charizard EX does 200 damage, and Mewtwo EX is 150 HP. So Charizard is one-shotting a Mewtwo EX, whereas Mewtwo EX is not one-shotting a Charizard. So overall, Mewtwo is a much more consistent deck, I would say, from Charizard, but just because Mewtwo is going to take 4, 5, 6 turns to get fully set up, the chances are that if the opponent does have a Charizard EX fully set up there with energies on its bench, you're just going to lose the game because there's just absolutely no answer to that Charizard EX once it is set up. Let's take a look at Charizard EX, and now we're going to see a massive drop-off in the meta share, right, and in the overall percentage of people that are playing Charizard EX. We go down from 28 and 26% respectively for Pikachu EX and Mewtwo EX, and now we're dropping all the way down to 7.5% meta share usage rate for Charizard EX, and this is actually in decline. A lot more people were playing Charizard a few weeks ago than they are certainly now. In fact, you see things like Arcanine actually taking the spot of Charizard EX, and as well as Rapidash and Ninetales, the Blaine deck, taking a lot of the meta share for Charizard. It was floating around 10 to 15% in the first couple weeks of online tournaments, but now settling down to about 7.5% meta share. And the average win rate for Charizard was actually a little bit higher than I expected it to be, I'm not going to lie, at 47.43%, so not even that much worse across the board than Mewtwo. And I think that's just because Charizard actually has a decent matchup against a lot of the rogue decks, or decks that aren't really considered meta decks that people still play pretty oftenly in these online tournaments. So not a terrible win rate, but certainly not a great win rate here for Charizard EX. And like I said earlier, with this deck, it takes a long time to set up. It's a high risk, high reward, definitely mid-range deck. You put your Moltres in the active spot, You wait 3-4 turns sometimes to get that Charizard set up, but if you are able to get a Charizard EX fully set up, or even two Charizard EXs set up, you know, by the time you get those things ready to go, they're going to have a bunch of energy, and they're just going to start one-shotting Pokemon, right? So it is certainly a deck that benefits a lot from drawing well, but if you don't draw well, there's no way to win the game, right? And that's really all Charizard EX comes down to. But if we take a look at the matchup spread with Charizard EX, we see a very, very poor matchup spread against Articuno here with 22.86% win rate. I think that comes down to just the fast-paced nature of the Misty decks, as well as Charizard, you know, taking that chip damage from Articuno on the bench. It also gets, you know, hit for super effective from water type Pokemon. I don't think that's necessarily part of the reason. I just overall think that if a Charmander is in the active spot, it's just going to get absolutely blown up, or even a Charmeleon, right? So you're always kind of in range to one-hit KO a lot of the Pokemon that aren't fully evolved in the Charizard deck. And we also see a losing matchup against Pikachu, and I think for similar reasons. Pikachu EX, this is a larger sample size, which I think is probably also why the matchup spread is so terrible for Articuno here. It's a much smaller sample size, right? Because less people are playing Charizard, and even less people, as you'll see, are playing Articuno EX. So the matchup spread there at 22.86% win rate, I think is a little bit skewed just by the smaller sample size. And I think that if we had a larger sample size, we would actually see that Articuno EX and Pikachu EX in terms of a matchup with Charizard are going to be fairly even. And as we can see there, Pikachu with a 40, or Charizard winning only 40% of its matchups against Pikachu. And again, I think that's for similar reasons for Articuno. A lot more consistent of a deck. Pikachu EX is a lot faster pace, and not something that Charizard EX particularly likes to deal with. But as you can see, 55.2% win rate against Mewtwo EX. So, you know, that's, I think, kind of the one calling card for Charizard, is that it does have a pretty good matchup against Mewtwo, but definitely a terrible matchup against the other two most common decks in this format. Lastly, we're going to take a look at the Articuno EX decks with Starmie, with Misty, sometimes some other water-type Pokemon, but for the most part, that's kind of what we're looking at here. And believe it or not, this is the 4th most played deck over the last 10 largest online tournaments, with a meta share of honestly under 5% at 4.48%, which is pretty staggering. Again, a pretty heavy drop off again, Charizard EX. And I believe the reason for this, and as you'll see, the matchup spread for Articuno is actually quite good. But the main reason that people aren't really bringing Articuno to online tournaments is just because that Pikachu EX decks exist, and they fill a very similar niche. The difference is that this deck here, being a water type deck, is weak to the Pikachu deck. So since Pikachu is by far the most played deck in the format, Articuno EX just does have a tough time against Pikachu, as you'll see here. But the overall average win rate of 48.78% is actually really good if you consider the fact that almost half the matches that this deck is going to be playing against are Pikachu decks. So yeah, very, very interesting. Not a super large sample size here for Articuno EX, again with a 4.4% meta share, but very good average win rate across the board. And if we go ahead and we take a look at the matchup spreads for Articuno, I think this kind of reflects that pretty accurately. Unfortunately, only a 35.1% win rate against Pikachu, and again, Pikachu is the most played deck in Pokemon TCG Pocket, and again, I think that's just the main reason why we don't see a lot of people playing Articuno decks. They're not playing Misty decks. So that's just because they have a pretty tough time going against Pikachu EX. Very similar decks in the way that they function and their pacing and their consistency. In fact, I would say that the Misty decks even have faster pace potential, with, of course, Misty being able to generate those energies. But interestingly enough, just I think the type advantage really gets to Articuno here. So very bad win rate, 35% against Pikachu. But a pretty even win rate across the board with Mewtwo EX here at 50.6%. Not bad at all. Definitely kind of a coin toss. Definitely comes down to the cards that you draw, whether you flip heads on Misty, things like that. I don't think that either deck particularly has a large advantage against each other, but a very, very good win rate against Charizard EX with 77.2%. So again, I would say that Articuno and Charizard actually have pretty similar places in the meta in terms of their impact and their matchup spread. But again, as we can see, Pikachu EX and Mewtwo are the two by far most played decks in the format, but also have probably the most consistent matchup spread across the board, with Pikachu most definitely being the most consistent deck with win rates across the board, but also having the best matchup spread against the other most popular decks and most popular archetypes in Pokemon TCG Pocket. Lastly, and I know you might be wondering, what about my Weezing deck? What about my, Rapidash deck or whatever like that? So I did manage to pull up this slide. Now, I didn't parse all of the data from all of the other rogue decks in these online tournaments, and that's really because like almost 50% of the meta share in these online tournaments, even from a competitive Pokemon TCG Pocket perspective, is made up entirely of decks that aren't really considered like real decks at all. I included the 4 next most common, right? So after the top 4 of Mewtwo, Charizard, Pikachu, and Articuno, these would be the next 4 most common decks, with Articuno being an honorable mention that I didn't include here just because we didn't have a large enough sample size for the Arcanine decks, but overall, that deck isn't performing extremely well anyway. I think it did make top cut in a recently large tournament, but yeah, the thing with the rogue decks is that they're kind of matchup specific, right? So things like Weezing here has a really great matchup against Mewtwo, but against basically any other meta deck, it does absolutely abysmally, and for that reason, it's kind of a meme deck. It's just not necessarily something that is worth running. You could get lucky, you could run exclusively into Mewtwo's, and then after getting lucky only hitting Mewtwo's, if that were to happen, you get lucky in those matchups, you could have a pretty good time here in tournaments. So not a terrible deck. I mean, you can have a winning win rate. You could even make it into top 8 potentially playing Weezing EX, but not EX, but just the Weezing decks with Muck or Wigglytuff. There's a lot of different different cards that people match up with Weezing, but overall, definitely not a card that is good across the board, but does have a pretty strong matchup against Mewtwo EX. And as we can see here as well, the Rapidash Ninetales deck with Blaines. This deck is really interesting because it actually has a really high usage percentage. I think over the last week or two, it's actually like the 5th or 6th most played deck in the format, but it actually has a losing win rate across the entire meta share. So like all of the other decks that are played more so than this deck actually has a losing win rate against. So it's interesting that it's still played to this extent, but I think that just kind of chalks it down to that this deck is really cheap to build. It's easy to build, and it's pretty straightforward to play. So it's not a terrible deck as far as sort of rogue deck options go, but it just doesn't have a winning win rate or a great matchup against any of the other meta decks in the format. And next, probably the most interesting one is going to be the Marowak EX decks, which have actually sort of risen in popularity over the last few weeks here, over the last few large online tournaments. And I think this kind of rose to prominence mainly because it has a winning matchup against Pikachu decks, but it's overall not a great consistent option when you compare it to a deck like Pikachu or even Mewtwo, or also like Articuno, right? So it's overall not a great deck, even though it does have a good matchup against Pikachu because of the type advantage. And it also, I guess, is probably the best fighting type option. People play Marowak with things like Machamp EX. They also use Hitmonlee to do some damage to the bench, to do some chip damage there. And Marowak is sort of a high roller card in its own right there. You flip 2 coins and you could potentially do 0 damage or 80 damage or 160 damage. So again, the potential to one-shot other EX Pokemon is pretty cool, but a very RNG based card on a stage 1 for 2 energies. It's sort of a less consistent version of Starmie EX. But yeah, overall, interesting pick. I see a lot of people playing it. It does have some pretty good records. It has done well in a few recent online tournaments, but overall, I think the only reason to play this deck is to counter the Pikachu EX metagame. And then lastly, I believe the 7th or 8th most played deck in these online tournaments is Venusaur EX. This one's, again, literally just, it's straight up a meme deck, right? This deck, from all of the statistics that I crunched, again, the sample size wasn't extremely large, which is why I didn't include any of the data for these decks, but overall, just a pretty abysmal win rate across the board. I think people play it just because it's Venusaur and it's pretty fun if you do get it set up. If you draw all the cards perfectly, it can be pretty annoying to deal with, but again, you have like almost a 0% chance of beating Charizard, and a pretty bad matchup across the board against all of the other meta decks. And that's just because it's too slow, it's too inconsistent, requires 4 energy on a stage 2 EX Pokemon with no way to accelerate those energies. You need to draw into your healing cards, you need to draw into all of your Pokemon to get the evolutions going. So yeah, Venusaur EX certainly not a real viable choice here in this meta of Pokemon TCG Pocket at the moment. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know down in the comment section below if this was entertaining to any degree, if you learned anything, if this was helpful, if this was useful. Again, link that will be down in the description below for the Play.Limitless platform if you want to compete in any online tournaments, or if you want to go ahead and take a look at some of this data yourself, you can look through it. And it also has all of the different deck lists for all of the decks that people are playing in these online tournaments. So if you're kind of looking to net deck or find some cool decks that you maybe have never heard of before, I definitely suggest that you go check it out. Yeah. thank you guys so much for watching. I've been Matty, Matty T. It's been a great experience over the last couple of weeks making some YouTube videos. It's been a while since I did that, but I'm pretty happy to be back, and it's been a pretty good time. So yeah, don't forget to hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe and comment below what you think is the best deck in Pokemon TCG Pocket. But in reality, it's Pikachu EX by a pretty wide margin, while Mewtwo certainly has the opportunity to win games because it does win games all the time. But yeah, overall, hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll see you guys